Picture this: Winston Churchill, the man who stared down Hitler, the voice that rallied Britain through its darkest hour, standing on a London street corner with tears streaming down his face. What could possibly break the Iron Prime Minister? Not the Blitz, not Dunkirk, not 2 years of standing alone against Nazi tyranny. No. What broke Churchill was hope. The sound of boots, American boots, thousands of them marching through the heart of London. Young men from Iowa and Detroit and Texas, 3,000 miles from home, here to fight a war that wasn't technically theirs to fight. And Churchill, watching them pass, spoke words that would echo through history. When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war. This is the story of that moment. But to understand why it mattered so much, we need to go back to the loneliest night of Churchill's life. December 7th, 1941. Chequers. The British Prime Minister's country residence. Churchill sat in his study when the news crackled through. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had attacked the American fleet in Hawaii. The United States Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, thousands dead, battleships burning in the tropical sun. And Winston Churchill went to bed that night and slept, as he later wrote, the sleep of the saved and thankful. Think about that for a moment. The man had just learned that America had been devastated in a surprise attack. Ships destroyed, lives lost, war spreading across the Pacific. And he slept peacefully. Why? Because Churchill understood something that would take months to fully materialize. He understood that Hitler had just lost the war. He just didn't know. Yet, for 2 years, Britain had stood virtually alone. After France fell in June 1940, after Belgium surrendered, after the British Army barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, there was only Britain, one island nation against the might of Nazi Germany. Churchill had watched his cities burn during the Blitz. London, Coventry, Liverpool, night after night of German bombs raining down. He had seen the casualty reports pile up. He had made the desperate calculations about how long Britain could hold out, how long before the food ran out, before the ammunition ran out, before the will to fight ran out. And through it all, he had one strategy, one desperate gamble: get America into the war. Churchill had been working on Franklin Roosevelt for years. Over 1,700 messages between them during the war years. Think about that number. That's not just diplomacy. That's obsession. He signed his early letters "former naval person," referring to his role as First Lord of the Admiralty. It was intimate, personal, bypassing all the normal diplomatic channels. Churchill was courting Roosevelt the way a desperate man courts his last hope. And he had reason to be desperate. The math of the war was brutal and simple. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Its armies were vast, battle-hardened, equipped with modern weapons rolling off production lines that worked around the clock. The Wehrmacht was the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Britain was hanging on by its fingernails. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 had helped. American ships brought tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food. But ships aren't soldiers. Supplies can't hold ground. Equipment can't storm beaches. Churchill needed American men, American soldiers, an American army in Europe, fighting alongside exhausted British troops. Throughout 1941, he watched and waited. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June, Churchill hoped maybe that would push America to act. When German U-boats started sinking American ships in the Atlantic, he hoped maybe that would be enough. But America stayed out. Isolationism ran deep in American politics. The memory of World War I, of American boys dying in European trenches, was still fresh. Roosevelt wanted to help, but Congress and the American public weren't ready for another European war. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 8th, America declared war on Japan. December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on America. Churchill immediately sailed to Washington. Spent Christmas 1941 with Roosevelt, planning strategy, coordinating their alliance. But Washington war rooms were abstract. Strategy sessions were just men around tables with maps and charts. The real test would come when American soldiers arrived in Britain. January 26, 1942, Northern Ireland. The first American troops landed on British soil. Just advance elements at first, small numbers. But it was the beginning of a flood that would change everything. Throughout spring and summer 1942, they kept coming. By year's end, over 100,000 American servicemen were stationed in Britain. By D-Day in June 1944, that number would exceed 1.5 million. They crossed the Atlantic in convoys, always watching for German U-boats. They landed at Liverpool, Belfast, ports all round the British Isles. Young men, most of them, farm boys who'd never left Iowa. Factory workers from Detroit who'd never seen the ocean before. Clerks from New York suddenly finding themselves in uniform, carrying rifles, 3,000 miles from home. They arrived in a country that had been at war for over 2 years, a country marked by rationing, bomb damage, exhaustion. Britain in 1942 was a nation running on fumes and pure determination. The British reaction to these Americans was complicated. On one hand, gratitude. These men were here to help fight a common enemy. On the other hand, resentment. The Americans seemed impossibly wealthy. They were paid far more than British soldiers. They had access to goods ordinary Britons hadn't seen in years. Better uniforms, better rations, better everything. British families were surviving on rations that allowed for ounces of bacon per person per week. 4 ounces. Meanwhile, stories circulated about American mess halls serving steak and ice cream. Ice cream. In wartime Britain, that sounded like a fairy tale. The phrase emerged quickly, usually said with humor, but humor with an edge, overpaid, oversexed, and over here. British soldiers, paid a fraction of American wages, watched American G.'s take British girls to dances and pubs. The tension was real, the friction inevitable. But beneath the friction was something deeper. Hope. Churchill felt this more acutely than anyone. He understood the mathematics of the war in a way few others could. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Its industries were producing weapons at an enormous rate. Its armies seemed unstoppable. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of German military power on the Eastern Front. Locked in a death struggle that was killing millions, Britain was holding on. But holding on wasn't winning. Churchill needed America's industrial capacity, its seemingly limitless resources, its fresh armies who hadn't been fighting for 2 years, who weren't exhausted, who still had that energy and confidence that comes from not yet being beaten down by war. He had seen the supply ships arriving, had tracked the numbers, had approved plans for American bases and training facilities across Britain. But seeing numbers on paper and seeing actual soldiers marching in formation through British streets, those were two different things. Then came the day that changed everything. A grey afternoon in London. The exact date matters less than what it represented. American troops were being moved through the city, a large contingent marching from one station to another. These weren't the first Americans Churchill had seen in Britain by this point. Months into 1942, American soldiers were a common sight. But this was different. This was a formal march through the heart of London, through streets that had been bombed during the Blitz, past buildings that still showed damage from German raids, past storefronts that were boarded up, past ruins that hadn't been cleared yet. Churchill made sure to be there. He positioned himself where he could watch them pass. His staff knew better than to interfere. When the Prime Minister wanted to witness something personally, the Americans came marching in columns, boots striking the pavement in rhythm. They wore their uniforms, their helmets, carried their rifles. Young men, most of them 18, 19, 20 years old, they marched with a particular bearing. Less rigid than British troops, perhaps, but confident. They knew they were part of something enormous. They had grown up hearing stories about World War I, about American doughboys going over there to fight in France. Now they were following in those footsteps. London crowds gathered to watch. Office workers came out of buildings. Shopkeepers stood in doorways. People lined the sidewalks. Some clapped, some waved. Children called out to them. The Americans grinned, waved back, kept marching. And Churchill watched in silence. His eyes moved along the columns, taking in the sight. His face, usually so expressive, was difficult to read. Those who stood near him later reported that his eyes were wet. Try to imagine what Churchill was feeling in that moment. For 2 years, he had carried the weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders. 2 years of making speeches, rallying the nation, making desperate decisions about where to send limited resources. 2 years of watching young British men go off to fight in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in the air over Germany. 2 years of reading casualty reports, of visiting bombed cities, of knowing that Britain was stretched to its absolute limit. 2 years of the constant question hanging over everything. How long can we hold out? He had given the speeches that defined Britain's resistance. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. Magnificent defiance, but defiance based on will, not certainty. And now here were the Americans, thousands of them, with thousands more coming. An entire nation's military power being deployed to Britain, preparing to take the fight to Hitler's Europe. Someone near Churchill asked him what he thought. The Prime Minister was silent for a moment, still watching the marching troops. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the emotion of those 2 years of standing alone. When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war. Asterisk, asterisk, it was a simple statement, but it carried enormous weight. Churchill was not given to simple optimism. He understood the realities of modern warfare, understood how difficult the road ahead would be. The invasion of France was still 2 years away. The Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats was at its height. The war in North Africa was undecided. The Soviets were locked in a desperate struggle at Stalingrad. But seeing the Americans march through London, seeing the physical manifestation of American commitment, Churchill allowed himself to believe in victory not just as a possibility, but as an inevitability. He elaborated, speaking to those around him, his words tumbling out in that characteristic Churchill manner. They are so young, so strong, so confident. Look at them. They have come 3,000 miles to help us. They have come to fight for freedom, for civilization, for everything we have been defending. His voice grew stronger. Hitler has made his greatest mistake. He thought America would stay neutral, would stay out of Europe's wars. He thought Britain would fall or surrender. He thought wrong on both counts. Now he faces not just Britain, not just Russia, but America as well. The greatest industrial power on earth, the greatest reserve of manpower, all of it now committed to his destruction. Churchill paused, pulling out his handkerchief to wipe his eyes. He was not embarrassed by the tears. "I've waited so long for this," he said quietly. "So long." Asterisk, asterisk, the people around him understood. They had lived through the same years, the same fears. The summer of 1940, when German invasion seemed imminent. The Blitz, when London burned night after night. The losses at sea, U-boats sinking ship after ship. The defeats in France, in Greece, in Crete. The desperate holding action in North Africa. The constant question, how long can we hold out? The Americans represented the answer. Not just military power, though that was crucial. They represented vindication of everything Churchill had argued for, everything he had worked toward. His courtship of Roosevelt, his speeches about Anglo-American partnership, his belief that the English-speaking peoples would stand together. All of it was being proven right in the most tangible way possible. Boots on British soil. As the march continued, Churchill's mood shifted from emotional to analytical. He began, pointing out details to his staff. Notice their equipment, modern, well-made. They have the industrial capacity to equip millions of men like this. Millions. He watched their faces. They are eager. They want to fight. That eagerness will cost some of them their lives. But it will also carry them through things that tired men cannot do. He was already thinking ahead, planning how to use this American energy, how to coordinate British experience with American strength. We must train them properly. They are brave but inexperienced. We have been fighting for 2 years. We know things they do not know yet. We must teach them what we have learned, and we must learn from them as well. Someone mentioned the friction between British and American troops, the complaints about pay differences and American abundance. Churchill waved it away impatiently. Of course there is friction. Put any two groups of young men together, and there will be friction. But they are on our side. That is what matters. They are here. They are real, and they are going to help us win. Asterisk, asterisk, the march took over an hour. Column after column of American soldiers passing through London. Churchill stayed. For all of it, watching until the last troops had gone by. He seemed reluctant to leave, as if the sight was sustaining him, feeding something he had been running on empty for too long. When it was finally over, he turned to his staff. "I want to meet some of them. Arrange for me to visit an American base. I want to talk to these young men, want to thank them personally." The visits were arranged over the following months. Churchill made a point of visiting American units stationed in Britain. He would arrive unannounced sometimes, or with minimal warning, wanting to see the troops as they actually were, not dressed up for formal inspection. He would walk through their camps, talk to small groups, ask where they were from, what they thought of Britain, whether they were being treated well. The American soldiers were often startled to find the British Prime Minister suddenly in their midst. Churchill was instantly recognizable. The round figure, the bulldog face, the ever-present cigar. He would shake hands, make jokes, ask questions. He wanted them to know they were appreciated, wanted them to understand what their presence meant to Britain. In one camp, he found soldiers from Texas. "Texas," he exclaimed. "I have been to Texas. Wonderful state, vast and full of energy. You Texans are known for your fighting spirit. We shall need that spirit in the days ahead." The soldiers grinned, pleased that this famous British leader knew something about their home. At another base, he encountered soldiers who had just arrived, still processing the reality of being in Britain. "You have come a long way," Churchill told them. "You have left your homes, your families, everything familiar. You have come to a country that has been at war for over 2 years. That is tired and worn. But I tell you this, your rival has lifted our spirits more than you can possibly know. When we see you, we see hope, we see strength, we see victory." He meant every word. Churchill understood symbolism, understood the power of morale. But this wasn't just symbolism. The Americans were real military power, real divisions that could be deployed, real air squadrons that could bomb German cities, real ships that could protect convoys. The strategic implications were enormous. Churchill and his military chiefs began planning operations that would have been impossible before American entry. North Africa could be reinforced, an invasion of Italy could be contemplated, and eventually, the great invasion of France could be planned. Operation Overlord, D-Day, the massive amphibious assault that would require American troops, American landing craft, American air power, American everything. But in that moment, watching the Americans march through London, Churchill wasn't thinking about specific operations. He was thinking about what it meant that these men were here at all. For 2 years, Britain had fought on, but always with the question hanging over everything. Can we actually win? Can we defeat Germany? Or are we just postponing the inevitable? The Americans answered that question. Yes, Britain could win, not alone, but with allies. With American industrial might and Soviet manpower and British determination, yes, Germany could be defeated. Asterisk, asterisk, the relationship between British and American forces would have its challenges. There were disagreements about strategy. Churchill wanted to attack Germany through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, through Italy and the Balkans. The Americans, particularly General George Marshall, wanted a direct assault across the Channel into France. There were tensions about command structures, about who would lead combined operations. There were the inevitable cultural clashes between British and American soldiers. But beneath all of that was the fundamental reality that Churchill grasped that day watching. The March. America was in the war, fully committed, and that changed everything. The young men marching through London that day would fight in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, in Germany itself. Many of them would die. American casualties in the European theater would exceed 300,000, with over 100,000 dead. They would fight at places whose names would become legendary: Omaha Beach, the Bulge, the Hürtgen Forest, the Rhine crossing. But they would win, alongside British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied forces, alongside the massive Soviet armies grinding forward from the east. The Americans would help crush Nazi Germany. The war would last another 3 years after that march through London. 3 years of brutal fighting. But the outcome, from the moment America fully committed, was ultimately decided. Churchill knew this. Standing there watching the Americans pass, he knew it. The emotion he felt, the tears in his eyes, came from relief as much as joy. Relief that the burden would be shared. Relief that Britain would not have to stand alone anymore. Relief that victory was now possible, not just as a desperate hope, but as a realistic goal. In his memoirs written after the war, Churchill would return again and again to the theme of Anglo-American partnership. He would write about the special relationship between Britain and America, would argue for maintaining close ties in the post-war world. Some of this was strategic calculation. Britain would need American support in the Cold War that followed, but some of it was genuine feeling, born in those dark years when American help meant the difference between survival and defeat. The march through London was not the first time Churchill saw American troops in Britain, and it would not be the last. But it represented something crucial, the moment when American involvement became real and visible, when the alliance moved from diplomatic agreements and shipping manifests to actual soldiers marching through British streets. Churchill had spent 2 years holding Britain together through force of will and eloquence. He had given speeches that rallied the nation, had made decisions that kept Britain in the fight, had worked tirelessly to build the alliance that would win the war. But will and eloquence could only do so much. At some point, you needed armies, needed soldiers, needed the physical power to fight back. The Americans brought that power, and watching them march through London, Churchill allowed himself to believe, fully, for perhaps the first time since becoming Prime Minister in May 1940, that Britain would not just survive but would win. When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war. It was not a boast. It was not propaganda. It was a statement of fact, spoken by a man who had carried the weight of Britain's survival for 2 years, and who could, finally, watching those American soldiers march past, set that weight down and share it with allies who had the strength to help carry it. The war would grind on. There would be setbacks and losses, difficult decisions and terrible casualties. But the fundamental equation had changed. Germany now faced not just Britain's defiance, but America's might, and that, Churchill knew, watching those young Americans march through London streets would make all the difference. The sound of boots on pavement, the sight of young faces under helmets, the knowledge that 3,000 miles away, millions more were training, preparing, getting ready to join the fight. That was the moment Britain knew it would survive. That was the moment Churchill allowed himself to hope. That was the moment when tears on the face of the Iron Prime Minister told the story that words alone could never capture. The long, lonely fight was over. America had arrived, and together they would win.